All right, we are here with Dr. William Breitbart, who is the chairman and Jimmy C. Holland Chair in Psychiatric Oncology at the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, and a pioneer in the field of consultation-liaison psychiatry. So, Bill, let's start by you to talk a little about what led you to consultation-liaison psychiatry, and in particular psycho-oncology as a career choice.
Well, thanks, John. It's really a pleasure for me to be participating in this series for the Academy of Consultation-Liaison Psychiatry. Well, you know, like many people who go into consultation-liaison psychiatry, I stumbled into it unintentionally. It's a little bit like the creating of meaning in my life. I was living a life of meaning, but unintentionally. Uh, so one day I did actually wake up and realize, oh, this is what I'm supposed to be doing in life. But the fact of the matter is that there are a couple of versions of the story, and I'll tell you the supervisional version first. I grew up on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. My parents were Eastern European Holocaust survivors, and I was the firstborn, and there were many expectations of me. And what was really valued in our culture, Jewish culture, was studying and learning and teaching. And I was very good at school, and I was very good in science and math, but I was also really good in the arts and writing and English. And when I went to a special high school in New York City called Stuyvesant High School, Math and Science High School. I did well in math and science, but I did even better in the English classes. And when I went to college, I really was confused as to what direction to take in my life. I loved math and science, and I was a chemistry major, pre-med. There was a lot of pressure in my family to become a physician, but I was also an English major with a concentration in poetry writing. And I must say, this is not an uncommon story when I interview fellows for our fellowship at Sloan Kettering. People who, a typical CL psychiatry fellow applicant, someone who actually likes medicine, likes science, but also likes the arts. It's not an uncommon combination, and a dilemma. It presents a dilemma as to what to do. And at some point, I decided that I would become a psychiatrist, in the sense that that would allow me to combine my interests in science and medicine, and also my interests in stories and narratives. There's an old Talmudic saying, a question actually, which is, what is truer than the truth? And the answer is the story. And stories were always very important to me. They made me feel connected to all human beings and my ancestors, and they connected me to the past, present, and future. And so and they really got at the essence of what it means to be a human being. Now, on this road towards becoming a CL psychiatrist, I did not really fully understand that what my goal in life, what my intention in terms of who I wanted to become in the world, was to understand human existence, and particularly to understand what it was like, what the experience of a human being was living a mortal, finite life. How do you confront the fact that you are mortal, finite, and have to die, face death? I didn't realize that that was my main goal, but on a more superficial level, it was this fascination and interest and joy in both science and the arts, medicine and narrative. And so the compromise was to go to school to become a psychiatrist. And in fact, I had these fantasies that I'd be a psychiatrist in the analytic mode. This was in the this is in the 1970s, mid 1970s, when I was finishing college. And I had this fantasy of sitting behind a patient who was on a couch and them talking, and me taking down notes and then writing down, oh, wow, that would be a great idea for a plot line for a novel of being a psychiatrist. Finally went to medical school, and the problem was compounded. I loved, uh, I loved medicine, every aspect of medicine. I loved answering. I loved detective work. I loved figuring out the diagnosis. I loved, I loved the process of diagnosis and intervention and treatment, coming up with that rare, unusual diagnosis. And I also loved communicating and understanding the human being who had the illness. And so I love medicine and I love psychiatry. And I was really confused. And during my internship, in those days, there wasn't the routine of going straight into a psychiatry residency from your internship on. You matched in an internship, usually medicine, and then you started a psychiatry residency, PGY 2, 3, 4 years, right? So I did a year of medicine. I loved it, but I also matched in the psychiatry program at Einstein. I went to medical school at Einstein and trained at Jacobi, Montefiore, which was the old stomping grounds for people like Jim Strain and Jimmy Holland, who I didn't have an opportunity to meet. Actually, they had left before my medical school days. But I loved both, and I couldn't decide which one to do. And at the end of my internship year, my department chair in medicine called me into his office, and he said somebody had dropped out of the class, and he'd had an empty slot for a PGY2 in medicine, and did I want to stay in medicine? And I thought about it quite a bit, and I said to myself, well, if I don't go and do my psychiatry residency, I'll never know if that was the right career for me. So I said no, and I started my psychiatry, my PGY 2 year of psychiatry on the inpatient units. My very first patient was a young man who was schizophrenic, and between you and me, John, I've never really met anyone in the last 40 years of my experience in psychiatry or medicine who was as bizarre and psychotic and confusing diagnostically ever. I mean, and he was sitting in the room with me. Our session started at 9 o'clock, and he was telling me all of these very strange, bizarre things. And I had just come from an internship where I could keep someone who was near death alive in an intensive care unit for as long as I wanted. You know, I was God. And I'm sitting in front of this guy and I'm completely helpless. And it must have shown on my face, because at one point he stops and says to me, tell me, how long have you been a psychiatrist? And I looked at my watch and I said, about 30 minutes. And in the back of my mind, I said, and not much longer, you know. And it was after that first case, I went to my psychiatry residency director and I said, I think I've made a terrible mistake. And I went through this process of having discussions with the chair of medicine, chair of psychiatry, and they were fighting over my body for a while. And the decision was made, we can't steal a resident from psychiatry. But the department chair in medicine said to me, he was a tough guy, and he said to me, Bill, if you come to me in May and you tell me that you like psychiatry and you don't want to come back, he made a gesture with his hand that indicated that something significant, life-altering would occur to me. So April and May came by, and guess what? I kind of liked psychiatry. But I remembered that interaction with the chair of the Department of Medicine, and I went back and I did my junior year of medicine, and I fell in love with it all over again. And so I had this dilemma. I did a year of medicine, a year of psychiatry, and I was quite confused. I sort of had the sense that I didn't want to have a career that was that in which I functioned almost like a mechanic, in the sense, you know, control someone's blood pressure, do this. I was more interested in the person who had the illness, but I also enjoyed a lot of the aspects of medicine. So we had 3 or 4 chief residents in the Department of Medicine. It was a very large medicine. There was a woman named Lois Schwartz, who was the secretary for the chief medical residents. And in those days, she had a Rolodex for young people. A Rolodex is a round thing that has a lot of cards alphabetized before the days of computers and things like that. And people would sit down with Lois and say, Lois, I want to do a GI fellowship. Who should I call? Or Lois, I need to do a fellowship in cardiology. Who's the best person to call? And she would connect you up with alumni, right? So I sat down with Lois and I said, Lois, I really don't know if I want to do medicine or if I want to do psychiatry. I'm really very confused. She goes to her Rolodex, spins the Rolodex, and she picks out a card. And the name on the card is Ned Casson. And she said, Edwin Casson, who we both know very well, who at the time was, I think, chief of the psychiatry service at MGH, and an icon of CL psychiatry. I called Ned Casson cold. He did not know who I was, except that when I called him up, I said, hi, my name is Bill Breitbart, and I'm a Jacoby resident. Ned proceeded to talk to me for more than an hour, and he opened my eyes to this entire field of CL psychiatry that was not that well described to me earlier and before, and opened up all of the possibilities of what I could do. So at that point, I actually made a decision about an intentional decision of how the next part of my training should go. I figured, okay, it'll always be useful for me to have internal medicine training when I do CL psychiatry. So I'm going to finish up one more year of medicine. Then I'll go back and do my CL training, and then my psychiatry training, and then I'll do a CL fellowship. So that's what I proceeded to do. And I ended up doing another year of medicine, went back, did 2 more years of psychiatry, and then started applying for fellowships. And I applied for fellowships with Norm Levy, who was at Westchester County Hospital, where he started a subspecialty of CL called psychonephrology. And the resident who was assigned to take me around to show me the CL service at Westchester was a young, hippie, long-haired, bearded guy named Jim Levinson, who took me around. uh, uh, at this point, I should say the video on Jim Levinson, right? And we talked, and I was very impressed with Norm Levy. And then my next fellowship was with Jim Strain at Mount Sinai. And Jim's telling me the story. One of the things I left out was during my senior year of medicine residency, I actually was diagnosed with a thyroid cancer and had surgery and treatment. It's quite rapid, quite out of the blue, and that bubble of invulnerability that was burst, I was able to kind of seal that over relatively quickly. A lot of people who hear my story think I went into psycho-oncology for that particular reason. That is not the reason, but in my 4th year of residency, I was the liaison to the oncology center, and I saw a lot of cancer patients. I ran groups for patients with cancer. I also ran groups for oncologists and nurses who are on the oncology unit. And I would, I try to read as much as I could about how to treat cancer patients. And the only names I could find were the names of Jimmy Holland and Mary Jane Massey, who had written a couple of chapters in textbooks on psycho-oncology. Those were the only names and sources of information in this field. But I didn't apply. I didn't know that I was going to do psycho-oncology. I'm interviewing with Jim Strain, and Jim hears my story, pretty much the same story I just told you. And Jim, for those of you who know Jim Strain, or maybe you watched the Jim Strain video, Jim Strain has a way of looking you very deeply in the eyes, as if he's reading your soul. It's a little bit like Larry David on Curb Your Enthusiasm, where someone says something and then he looks at them very closely. So Jim gave me one of those looks, and then he said to me, "You know, Bill, Jimmy Holland at Sloan Kettering started a psychiatry service there in the Department of Neurology, and they have a new fellowship. And I think you should apply to that fellowship." I said, "Okay, sounds good. Thank you, Jim." I thought, A, it was good advice. B, he wasn't going to take me to his fellowship, so he thought maybe I should steer me in the direction of a fellowship I might get into. And a few weeks later, I applied, and I met Jimmy and Mary Jane and Lina Lesko, who were the three sort of pioneers, psychiatrists in the psychiatry service there at Sloan Kettering. And next thing you know, I'm a fellow at Memorial Sloan Kettering. And that's how I ended up at Memorial Sloan Kettering. And then there's a great deal of a lot of stories about what happened after that point. But on my interview, what's really telling is, I talk the same game that everyone else who applies to fellowship in CL talks. I love how medical conditions can mimic psychiatric conditions. I love figuring out the detective work of figuring out that a psychiatric presentation is actually from pellagra or some other kind of weird stroke, the Bonnet syndrome or something like that, looking for Kaiser Fleischer rings to make, patients who had copper copper metabolism abnormalities and things like that. So that was my fascination, and that's what I talked about. And they also liked the fact that I had had that experience of being a liaison to a psycho-oncology program. I actually wrote a couple of papers I did a small study on the group that I ran for oncologists and nurses, which basically showed that if you had a past history of cancer in your family, you were very likely to be to go into oncology. That was sort of the first little piece of bad research I did in my residency. And so actually in the early phases of my career, I started to do the kind of things that someone who's trained in medicine and psychiatry would normally do. I became fascinated with delirium, major neuropsychiatric complications in cancer that came from medical illness. I was interested in pharmacologic interventions and understanding steroid-induced neuropsychiatric disorders. Came to liaison to the pain service, and I got very interested in the role of psychiatry and psychosocial aspects of cancer pain, and also antidepressant medications and their use in neuropathic pain and all sorts of cancer pain. And then I did my residency at the height of the AIDS epidemic, and so I got very interested in AIDS and neuropsychiatric complications of AIDS and delirium in AIDS and pain in AIDS and fatigue. So I focused on depression studies and anxiety studies, many of them either pharmacologic interventions or epidemiologic studies. But in retrospect, the real genesis for my interest in CL psychiatry goes back to the thing I first mentioned, which was that my parents were Holocaust survivors from Eastern Europe, and I've written about this quite a bit in various venues, including this journal that I've edited over the last 19 years. Cambridge University Press's international journal called Paleo and Supportive Care, which I founded and been the editor-in-chief of. I get a chance to write poetry and essays in the journal, which allows me to go back to my early college days and my first love of poetry and writing. So, I grew up on the Lower East Side with my parents. My mother was 14 and my father was 17 when the war broke out. And my mother was in hiding with her parents in a hole under the stove of a Catholic woman who hid them. My father was 17 and he was drafted into the Russian army as the Russians came through. And then he was sort of at the back at the end of the line. And he deserted and just ran into the woods, and he hooked up with a group of about 100, 150 partisan fighters in the forest of, of Poland, near the Carpathian, foot of the Carpathian Mountains. And one day, my father and a group of young men were looking for food, and they broke into this farmhouse where my mother and grandparents were hiding in a hole under the stove. And they came upon my mother and her parents, who would come out of the hole at night to eat something. As it turns out, my father and my maternal grandmother are second cousins. And that's why my brother and I both have a very rare genetic Jewish Ashkenazi Jewish disease. We're definitely, I am definitely the, we all have fantasies that maybe we were adopted. I certainly had a fantasy that my brother was adopted, but as it turns out, there's genetic proof that neither of us were adopted. And my father said to my grandparents and my mother, it's not safe here. You've got to come with me into the woods. My grandparents were afraid to go, but they let my mother go, of all things. I would never have imagined this. So my mother and father were in the woods hiding for close to 3 years. And and I thought about a lot about this during COVID, when COVID was at its height, when we were all quarantined at home. My parents slept on the forest floor. They didn't have a change of clothes. They didn't have Netflix or a shower or the internet, right? In the winters, they had to sleep holding each other to not freeze to death. That I learned is the basis for a 60-year marriage later. In fact, once the war was over, they crossed the border. They went back to look for my grandparents. Miraculously, they were there, alive. They all crossed the border into Germany and were in a displaced persons camp outside of Munich called Fehrenwald. And then my mother and father got married in that displaced persons camp. And at my grandfather's unveiling of his headstone, many of the people who had survived the Holocaust, who came from the same small town, were at this unveiling. And what's really interesting, my father ran a restaurant, a very famous Jewish dairy restaurant called Ratner's. I have a picture of it in the back there. That's Ratner's restaurant, the storefront. And all the other survivors, they all went into some aspect of the food business, wholesale eggs, wholesale bread, wholesale pig, smoked fish. My conclusion was that the butchers, bakers, they must have been terribly hungry those years. They needed to make sure they had food. So there were two men who I'd grown up with. These people became surrogate families, and Mr. Berg and Mr. Reschelbach. And at this point, I had finished my residency in medicine. I was in the middle of psychiatry. They knew I was some kind of physician. And so they were trying to get free medical advice. And they were telling about their aches and pains. And Mr. Reschelbach says to me, you see, I was chopping the head off a chicken and I missed the chicken and I cut off these 2 fingers, and then Mr. Berg said that's nothing. You see this defect here in my arm? I was hacking up piece and went like that, so these were the stories. And I must have looked a little aghast. And Mr. Reschelbach said, well, I have an even better story for you. And he said to me, the night that your parents got married, your father lived in the men's barracks, and your mother lived in the women's barracks, and they had no bed to sleep in on their wedding night. So my wife and I gave your parents our wedding bed. So you owe me more than you think. And debt, what I owe, and the debt that I owe humanity and the universe for actually the miracle of randomness of my actual existence. I look back at what my parents went through and I say to myself, if my father or mother had made a left turn or a right turn one day instead of a right turn or a left turn, I wouldn't be here. So it's just a miraculous thing. So I might as well, you know, it could so easily not have happened. I might as well enjoy the ride. But growing up in this home on the Lower East Side, the Holocaust, I sometimes describe the fact that the Holocaust lived with us in that apartment on the Lower East Side. It was in every room. It wasn't small enough that we could just lock it in one of the rooms. It was in every room. It was on all of the wallpaper. It was on every picture that was saved from those days. It was in every religious article that was saved. And I grew up with death, stories of death and loss and suffering. And so at age 4, 5, this was very real to me. Death was very real to me. And my mother would ask my younger brother and I the same question every morning at breakfast. She would say, why am I here? And the full question really was, why am I here? And everyone else died. So the real dilemma, the real question, the burning question, the product of all the existential guilt related to surviving became a burden, an obligation for me to answer. In other words, I needed to answer the question. It's my job, or my burden, to answer the question why my parents, my mother in particular, survived the Holocaust. So the obligation was to create a life that was going to have such an impact, such significance, such an impact on the world, particularly in the realm of suffering, particularly in the realm of dealing with the suffering that comes from having to face one's mortality and death. That my achievements in this area would be of such significance that they would justify my parents' survival. And my mother would be able to say, you see, we had to survive, otherwise there wouldn't be a Bill Breitbart in the world. I use my Yiddish name. Now, I grew up in a neighborhood with a lot of kids who had the same story. I went to an Orthodox Jewish school, and my story was replicated in like 25 of my classmates in a class of 30. And so for many of so this was a burden. So for me, it was the burden was an inspiration. It gave me a purpose. It gave me an intention in my life, right? But and so many of the kids in my class, they became psychiatrists, neuroscientists, philosophers, playwrights, people who delved into the understanding human existence in all of its varieties from multiple directions. But for some of the kids in my class, it was a crushing burden. And I hope there are no dentists or people with very close relatives who are dentists listening to this. But the ones where it was a crushing burden, those are the kids who became dentists in my community.
Well, gosh, thank you so much, Bill. That is a wonderful story in so many ways, a great illustration of the power of narrative and linking the meaning from narrative into your life, and what an elegant solution to your medicine versus psychiatry dilemma that is such a perfect fit for what has been most meaningful to you in your life. And countless patients and students in the field have been the beneficiary. So thank you.
Right. Yeah, well, the one thing I want to say is that once I started to realize this, and actually I didn't realize it first, but I started to do work during the AIDS epidemic on desire for hastened death. I couldn't understand, why would someone actually want to die? You know, I get, I understand it a little better now, but I was trying to understand that. And so did a series of studies looking at desire for hastened death and what leads to that. And the first thing that popped up was depression. There were a few other factors like uncontrolled pain, lack of social support, physical debilitation, but depression was by far made up about 45% of the variants. You're about 7 times more likely to have desire for hastened death if you're depressed. And that was my first foray into trying to understand, why would a person want to die? What allows a person to still feel like life was worth living? And we even did studies looking at what happens to desire for hastened death when you treat depression. And we showed that if you treat depression in someone who has desire for hastened death and depression, the desire for hastened death remits. But it didn't explain the entire model. So we did more studies, and we found that loss of meaning and loss of hope were these other very important factors, both individually and synergistically. It made up another 35%. And here was someone who had spent uh, 20 years up to that point doing pharmacologic intervention trials and stuff. And I didn't have a drug. We didn't have any studies on psilocybin then. But, I didn't have a drug to treat loss of meaning. So I turned to the work of Viktor Frankl. At that point, I was a faculty scholar of the Project on Death in America. I believe you were too, right, John?
Yes.
Yeah, so we both know it's a very special program started by the Open Society Institute, which supported about 10 faculty scholars a year from about the mid 1950s to close to the mid 2000s. And they supported the work of 10 scholars a year. And this was the nidus of a group of people who actually helped create modern day palliative care in the United States. And we were people like you and me and Harvey Chachnoff and others were the sort of the nidus of psychiatric palliative care, psychiatric psychosocial palliative care. But it wasn't until I started to do that, and in one of the retreats, I had learned about Viktor Frankl's work and a lot of other philosophers like Heidegger, Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard, etc. And I started getting in Yalom. I started getting interested in finding a way to treat loss of meaning and hopelessness through developing a psychotherapy that was based on some of Frankl's concepts of meaning and sources of meaning. And that's been taken up the last 15 years of my career. And that coincided with this realization why I ended up going into psycho-oncology in the first place. That put all the Rubik's Cube finally got solved. I understood exactly why I ended up where I ended up. I needed to be in a place where I could breathe the same air of people who were dealing directly with the issues that I wanted to understand desperately.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you again. And also, rewinding a little bit, thanks for explaining to our younger viewers what a Rolodex is.
Yes.
That was very helpful. One of the things that I have always loved and admired about you is, as seriously as you take your work, that you do not take yourself seriously, and that having fun, from the first time we met, one of the things that I really loved about you was how you were able to have fun and make hard work, excellent work, meaningful work, fun. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I think it's sort of the way I never had the opportunity to think very highly of myself, and and so I never really took myself too seriously. And that's because at almost every phase of my education and life, there were always people who were smarter than me around me. I never thought of myself as the smartest guy in the room. I did think of myself as having two qualities that allowed me to succeed. One was will and stamina. Curiosity, will, and stamina. I needed to understand problems that I confronted at the bedside or in patients, and that was my motivation. That's always been my motivation. My motivation has been to understand clinical problems and find solutions. And I'll give you a great example of this. I was making rounds with Dr. Holland one day, and I was the liaison to the neuro-oncology unit. And I was seeing an awful lot of patients with brain tumors, spinal cord compression, who are on extraordinarily high doses of corticosteroids, dexamethasone. And they were all developing steroid-induced delirium, which was inaccurately called steroid psychosis. steroid-induced delirium and manias and depressions. And I was on rounds with Dr. Holland. I was very early in my career. I think I was a fellow, a second-year fellow. And by the way, I went to do the fellowship like most of our fellows, applicants. Went to do the fellowship with the intention of becoming a good clinician. I wanted to be an expert clinician. I had never had an intention to become a researcher. This was never anything I ever imagined for myself. But I found myself at Memorial in this very unique place where there were just layers and layers and layers of these very bright people who were all answering questions, doing research and answering questions, not necessarily all in the psychiatry service, but all of my colleagues, all of the fellows in medicine and things like that, and all of the faculty, etc. So it was a very stimulating place. But we're making rounds, and I asked Dr. Holland, I said, Dr. Holland, what's the story with, steroids and neuropsychiatric effects of steroids? How often does it happen? Why does it happen? What's the best treatment for it? And this is the sign of a really great mentor, someone who has launched the careers of about 25 pioneers in the field. She said to me, well, Bill, I really don't know. I guess you'll just have to go figure that out yourself. So I said, okay. So then the first thing I did is I did like a systematic review, and then I designed a study in patients with epidural spinal cord compression who got high doses of corticosteroids. And I had a naturally occurring control group of patients with cord compression that wasn't high grade, and both groups got radiation, but only one group got steroids. And I did a prospective study. I had a lot of help, a lot of collaborators in figuring out the design of the study and writing that first IRB protocol. And with a visiting fellow from Switzerland, a fellow named Fritz Stiefel, who's quite a famous researcher now in Switzerland himself. We went out and we did this study, and it took me 3 years to actually write the results, which is a warning to everyone else. Your first study takes like 4 years to actually do and write up and all that, so don't be discouraged. But the characteristic that I had was one of being curious and having stamina. I never really gave up. I would apply for research grants, and I would get rejected, or I'd have a revise and resubmit. Other people would get disappointed and they would get hurt and they go, the hell with it, it's not worth it. But for me, it was a challenging game. I was going to make the NIH or the NIMH or the NCI give me that. They had to give me that money. And the reason was because I had to do that study. I didn't have to do the study to become famous or to advance my career. I had to do this study because I needed to understand that problem and find an answer. And so that's the main characteristic. I think I just wouldn't give up. The other thing I think all of us have a little bit of one little thing that we maybe have you might call that we're genius at. Something that on a population level, we do that a little bit better than maybe majority of the population. I had a knack, because I was so immersed in clinical care. I had a knack of figuring out what the next important study, what the next important clinical problem was going to be, and we needed to study. So I was about 4 months ahead of everybody else in terms of figuring out what you had to do. Now, I don't know exactly that answers your question of why I'm sort of. I grew up in a funny household. My parents were funny. My younger brother was funny. We were very in touch with our imperfections and our and I came from very modest, humble, backgrounds. We were poor, but we didn't know it, kind of thing. I never really thought of myself being anything special. When Jimmy asked me to stay on as a faculty member, my first reaction was, I haven't done enough yet, Jimmy, to deserve this, you know. But I do like to have fun. I do like to have fun, and I'm remembering right now a trip to Birmingham that you invited me to give a grand rounds at the medical center there, and you picked me up at the airport, and we had a grand time at was it a 7-Eleven at the gas station where I tanked up on moon pie and Dr. Pepper, Diet Dr.
Absolutely,
Pepper,
yes.
which I had never had in my life growing up in Manhattan.
We
So it
toured
was
we toured some of the finest junk foods in the Southeast.
exactly. I am a connoisseur of junk food.
Absolutely.
And people are a little bit taken aback when they meet me too, because I've been a chair for a bunch of years now, and I do not, you know, I don't have a hierarchical kind of style in terms of leadership, you know, and I don't ask anybody to do anything I don't do, and you know, I remember. I feel like I'm still a fellow, so you know, I remember, like one of my patients said to me recently, I still feel, you know, like I'm uh, 25 years old, but now I have some real like bad arthritis. I'm just like a 25-year-old with arthritis.
Yes. Well, you mentioned a moment ago about Jimmy Holland's incredible skill as a mentor, but you also have incredible skills as a mentor. And particularly I think of your work with the Network Project, and yeah, and that mentorship on a large scale. Can you talk about about mentorship and the meaning that brings to you and how that's fit into your career?
Yeah, well, you know, there at one point in my career when you know, Jimmy was retiring from being the chair, and I was sort of mid career. It was just before I started. It was just as I was beginning to do that meaning centered psychotherapy work, and I kind of placed myself in the running as the to be the next chair of the department, and it didn't appear that they were biting. You know, part of it I think is that Memorial likes to bring people from the outside, but the fact of the matter is, at that point, I had had about, I don't know, 6 to 8 R01 and investigator initiated grants. I had a CV that was not not paralleled in the field of psychoncology or CL psychiatry for that matter as a clinician scientist. And I'd been chief of the psychiatry service, so I had a little bit of administrative experience, and I served for a great deal of time as Jimmy's right hand, so I knew the job of being chair. But I wasn't selected to be the chair, and one of my really good friends from Australia, David Hussein, came and took over as chair for a period of about 9 years. And it was turned out to be very fortuitous because that 9 years allowed me to really develop my meaning-centered psychotherapy to the point where we were able to get about 5 different grants to do 4 randomized controls, the group format, individual format, and start to do adaptations and write manuals and a textbook, stuff like that. So it was fortuitous, and then I became the chair, and I do have some advice about whether people should take on being chair or not. But at the point when I wasn't chosen to be chair, I actually sat down and made a list of the things that I love to do and the things that I hate to do, and where is the best place for me to do the things I love to do. So on the list of things that I hate to do was administration, finances, and hiring and firing, you know, firing people, you know, disciplining people, things like that. All the things that chair does, politics, it was on that list. The things that I love to do was taking care of patients, teaching, and I love teaching. I love teaching. it's probably part of. I think that if I had been born 100 years earlier and grew up in Poland, I might have been a rabbi. You know, I might have been a Talmudic scholar and rabbi. In fact, I have a great grandfather who was a Talmudic scholar uh, and and teacher. I love teaching, and you need to have new information all the time. Keep on teaching, right? You can't get the same lecture every year at the Academy of Psychiatry. Nobody's going to come, you know. So I have new material. It's a little bit like when I was in college. I actually took a course in stand-up comedy.
Ah,
Yeah, and the final for the course in stand-up comedy was to perform for 5 minutes at the comedy club on the Upper East Side at 3 o'clock in the morning. Well, I bombed. I really bombed because I discovered that I can be funny, but if I have to be intentionally funny, it doesn't work. Uh, so- but I love performing. I love performing, and I love affecting people in an emotional way. Uh, I I've heard other people describe me as the Steven Spielberg of lectures. You know, I like to take people on a ride, or, you know, to take them to a sad place, a very profound place, a euphoric place, a funny place, whatever. But I want to teach them, and I know that, and I love teaching on rounds with fellows. And I know that you learn best when you have some kind of emotion that's connected to the learning. Um, and I remember one time I was giving a lecture in Brazil, and I had simultaneous translation. And I was talking about advanced cancer patients. It might have been meaning-centered stuff. And the translator suddenly broke down and cried. And there was like uh, this, um, not a hush, but a gasp in the audience, and I couldn't figure out what's going on. You know, I was talking, and suddenly the audience is gasping. As it turned out, the translator had broken down
mm,
and cried. And I thought to myself, "Wow, that is one major milestone in my career as an orator and lecturer. The second major milestone of my career as as an orator and teacher happened in you'll appreciate this, John, Greenville, South Carolina. I spoke in a ballroom to 400 cancer survivors, and I'm a big fan of the oratorical style of Barack Obama. And I don't know if you remember when he gave the eulogy in Charleston after so many people were shot and killed, and he broke into song. He broke into a song singing "Amazing Grace," and I remember that event. And I remember saying to myself, one day, if I have the opportunity, I will sing in front of an audience. So I was in this event, uh, uh, giving a talk to these survivors, and it was around holiday time. It was around Christmas, and they had before I spoke, the head of the cancer center spoke, talking about me, and then there was a pastor who did an invocation, a prayer, an invocation, and then there was a choir that sang a variety of religious and secular holiday songs, and they were all in like black robes, like a real church choir. I think they were called the Divine Bells, or yeah, something like that. And then I had to speak, right? And I was sitting there at this front table with the head of the cancer center and his wife, and they were about to go to New York, and they were very excited because they were going to see the musical Hamilton. They were going to go see the musical Hamilton, and I love the musical Hamilton. I've seen it about 8 times, and I know all the words and things like that. And I told them, "Oh, you're going to love it," and all that. And so I get up there and I said, and I'm talking, and I said, let's give a hand to the Divine Bells. You know, what a great performance. And I announced, well, I can announce to your relief that I will not be singing tonight. The entire audience went, oh, started chanting, sing, 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 right? So I felt obligated, and I said, okay, this is for Dr. So-and-so and his wife who are going to New York City. And I sang the first verse of, of the song, Alexander Hamilton. My name is Alexander Hamilton. And so I left there going, I finally achieved that wellness goal. But I love teaching. I love teaching. I don't, part of it is, I guess, performance. Part of it is just the fact that I'm able to affect people and change how they view the work that we do, and give them something that allows them to, as you know, that goal, that burden that I took was to have this impact on the world in terms of suffering. So I have that impact through direct clinical care. I have it through my research and the papers I write. I have it through the textbooks that I edit and distribute. I have it through the journal that I edit, but I also do it through teaching of fellows and mentoring. I think there've been 300 fellows now, and all the audiences that I speak to. So that's how I fulfill who who I am, and my intention in the world to improve care. It amplifies the the obligation of easing suffering by helping people, give them tools to do that. So the network project was one of actually two what are called NCI R25 training grants, and the network project was really sort of my first foray into that, where we trained a national cohort over 10 years, about 1,000 clinicians from around the country, psychiatrists, palliative care docs, nurses, etc. We taught them about psycho-oncology and cancer pain management. And then we just, we're now in year 6 of another R25 grant, teaching people meaning center psychotherapy, a variety of clinicians. So we're going to do that for about 10 years, and maybe this time they'll give me a third renewal. It all depends. But yeah, it's another way to be who I am, and to enact the intention. Now, there's a big difference between who you are as a person, who you want to become in a person, and what you do. When I talk to, they have me talking to the palliative care fellows in the middle of the year and towards the end of the year. They want to make sure that the palliative care fellows are surviving palliative care fellowship. And obviously, I do this with our psycho-oncology fellows as well. And what's really interesting is, I often start a conversation where I ask a fellow, who do you want to become in the world? And they go, who? Who do I want to become? And I go, yeah, who are you, and who do you want to become? How do you want to grow in terms of the who? How do you want to transform that who? Because we're all being and we're becoming, and they don't know how to think about that. They know what they want to be. I always get the answer, I want to be a really good palliative care doctor. I want to be a really good SEAL psychiatrist. And I say, that's a what? That's a what? You have to know who you are, and who you are is composed of your values and what you see as virtues, the attitudes that you take towards, perspective that you take towards life, and the intention that you have with your life, right? And so hopefully what you do with what you do in terms of your work allows you to express who you are. And so lecturing and teaching and research and writing, those all allow me to be who I am. Being the chair for the last almost 10 years has been a challenge for me, because it's taken me into a realm of activities that I didn't naturally see as how do they fit into contributing, allowing me to grow and being who I am. And when I finally saw it as an opportunity to not only keep growing programs and innovation, but also mentoring my faculty, it was then that I started to see the reward in being a chairman, and put up with all of the things that were on my list of things I absolutely hate.
Well, let me wrap up with this, although you've been answering this question all along. But yeah, given that a main purpose of this whole project is to create documents for younger and future consult liaison psychiatrists to see. What that we haven't covered would you like to pass on to folks who are new to our field?
Well, it's an interesting question. It's one of those questions that when you interview for being chair of a department, I guess it was 9, 10 years ago now, and I went for a series of interviews with this committee that had been formed to recruit a new chair, and as I found out, I was the only applicant. I don't know why I don't know why they went through the process of making me go through interviews with people. But the head of the committee, a very lovely person who I admire greatly, she's the chair of our Department of Radiology. She asked me this kind of, the typical kind of pro forma question you ask a chair applicant. And she asked me what I want my legacy as chair to be. And I kind of stopped for a second. I looked at her. I wondered if she had read my CV. I wondered if she had read what I've been doing for the last 25 years. I wanted to say to her, I already created my legacy. People are going to remember me for the research I did and the teaching that I did, the research I did in AIDS, pain, and delirium, and fatigue, and desire for hastened death, and meaning-centered psychotherapy, and cytokines in pancreatic cancer depression. That's what people are going to remember me for. There's nothing that I'm going to accomplish as chair that's going to add that much to my legacy. My legacy is pretty well established. I know what's going to be on my obituary. I already know what my obituary is going to say. Unless some scandal hits me in the next couple of weeks, which will then be the first line. So I almost toyed with the idea of actually saying that out loud, but I realized, hey, I'm interviewing for chair, and I wanted to. So I gave her a perfunctory answer. Perfunctory answer. In meaning-centered psychotherapy, we ask people to describe the legacy that they want to leave behind. So it's a common question. I think there's one important thing. There's something that I've So the way I understand legacy, the legacy that you're given by your ancestors and by my teachers, the legacy that I've been given by my parents and my grandparents and their great-parents, the legacy that I've been given by Ned, Cassim, Jim Strain, Jimmy Holland, Tom Wise, even Don Oken, people like that, Mike Popkin, all the Norm Levy, all Jim Levis, all the greats. I've been given this legacy. I've created a life of my own, a work of my own that ultimately will be the legacy that I leave behind. But what it really boils down to is, I think we're here. There's a Doobie Brothers song. I don't know if you're a big fan of the Doobie Brothers, are you, John?
I like the Doobie Brothers. Yes.
You like the Doobie Brothers. So I actually also listen to the lyrics, especially the Michael McDonald songs. And there's a song called "Here to Love You," and what he said was, "Passing love along is what we were born to do." Mm. And so I hope my legacy is to pass love along. And by love, I mean wisdom. Mm-hmm. Wisdom of how to be a human being. The one thing that I hope on a sort of a more concrete level, right? In terms of what might be useful and less abstract to people, young CL psychiatrists who might be watching this, is one of the concerns I have about our field is that we tend not to cultivate, train, and create very many clinician scientists in our field. There are very few people who train in CL psychiatry, go into CL psychiatry, train in CL psychiatry, who develop careers as clinician scientists. The vast majority of our field is filled with very valuable clinician educators, but I don't know how much longer we can exist as a discipline and as a science, a scientific field, a scientific subspecialty, a medical subspecialty, a psychiatric subspecialty, unless we also have that component of developing the science of our field, developing the interventions of our field.
Yes.
And so one of the things that we've been trying to do in our fellowship, we've created, because what's happened is I exist in this world of clinician scientists within the world of behavioral medicine, right? And I go to study section at NIH and this and that, and I'm often the only psychiatrist in the room of 30 reviewers. Everyone else is a PhD. Now, even if you're just collaborating with a PhD, the PhDs often don't know the clinical problems in the same level of depth that we do. But it's very rare for us to be the clinician scientist in the room, the clinician who's developing the interventions, the clinician who's looking at the biology of the problem. Mm-hmm. I can count on one hand the number of CL psychiatrists who do that. And so I think we need to really focus on that a bit more. And in our fellowship, we've created, with ACGME accreditation, all of our fellows now are MDs. In the 40 years that we've had a fellowship at Memorial, we used to have classes of 6 folks who were a mixture of MDs and PhDs, and the PhDs and MDs could collaborate a little bit on the PhDs, know a little bit more about scientific method and this and that. And, so we now have a dedicated MD CL psychiatrist research fellowship track right after the clinical fellowship here. So we're trying to create more CL psychiatrists who are researchers, and that's my plea, I think, for the field. And I hope that's part of my legacy, to be an example of someone who was able to do that, who wasn't able to do it because I was so smart or was so unusual, because I didn't sleep, or because I get 8 hours of sleep at night every night, and I'm hoping that's my legacy, as an example of the fact that that's possible to do, and you don't have to be extraordinary or brilliant or whatever, as long as you're interested in it and dedicated. That's one of the things I hope to convey with what I've been able to pass on, that I've been able to achieve with my career.
Very good. Bill, thank you so much for sharing your story and for your example of building a legacy by living with meaning. I'm really grateful to you for participating in this project and appreciate your time.
I'm really grateful to you, John, and I'm very grateful to the Academy in general. The Academy has been my home for 35 years at least. I joined the Academy right after fellowship. I had my first opportunity to get involved in leadership of the Academy when Ned Kasem was president of the council, and he asked you and I, John, to write that position paper, a task force. Was it on physician-assisted suicide?
Yes, it was.
Right, that was my first opportunity. And to people who are listening, if you're given a job at the Academy, do it, take it on. It's worth it. It pays off. And then when Dr. Hahn became, I think, the first woman president of the Academy, I was the scientific program director. And then eventually had a career in the council where I had every job you could have in the council, treasurer, secretary, vice president, president-elect, president, governor, whatever. And I've also been so grateful to the Academy for recognizing my achievements. I've gotten the honor of winning the Research Award and the Hackett Award, and it's been my home. And I just want to say, though, my very first meeting at the Academy, remember the story of the Rolodex and being told, Ned Casson. The very first Hackett Award lecture I heard was Ned Casson's Hackett Award lecture, where he told the story of a fisherman who was fishing on his boat, and he fell into the water and a shark bit off half of his leg. And I'm sitting there, and I may have looked at you and I said, what does this have to do with CL psychiatry? And it was there that I realized I have total freedom to do whatever I want to do. So I gave a bizarre off kilter talk at my Hackett Award lecture as well. But it was that kind of experience where so many of my friends came from my interactions and networking at the Academy. So many meetings where I would sit with Paula Trepash and Don Rosenstein and a whole group of people, and we would get into these big discussions of religion and spirituality and things like that. So I owe the Academy a great debt. It's allowed me, it helped foster my career. It supplied the vital energy to keep fueling my will to achieve things and keep going in the field. So I appreciate the Academy doing this.
We'll build the Academy, and its members love you right back.
Thanks very much, Sean.